Speed round. 1939, by that time, radioactive isotopes of zinc had been isolated. We knew just enough about things to figure out things could be or could not be radioactive, and also find out there are isotopes that aren't radioactive. Not everything with the word isotope is radioactive. Homer Simpson. Radioactive isotopes listings from Wikipedia. Cadmium has 20 of them. Not all of them are radioactive. Zinc has 8. Not all of them are radioactive. Not all of them are dangerous, even. Even the ones that are radioisotopes may not be radioactive. Zinc-65 is a radioisotope that's used as a tracer in biological studies for plants and animals. It should also be pointed out for a very long period of time, in order to create new mutations in wheat and in animals, people would radiate animals and plants to try to get them to Frankenstein into new things. But you're all worried about Monsanto doing DNA changes and carefully testing in the lab. And being assholes about it, I should point out. Anyway, enough of the rope-a-dope roundup. To determine the dispersion and geographical range of a weapon, like a biological weapon or radioactive fallout or a dirty bomb or a bioweapon, chemical weapon, the U.S. Army Corps created Operation Large Area Coverage, Operation LAC, 1957 to 1958. They dispersed microscopic particles over much of the U.S. or in other countries with permission of the people in the area in most cases. And they did this by using something that would glow bright yellow or green if exposed to ultraviolet light at night, so they could track it easy. Because it glows with ultraviolet light, that does not necessarily mean that it's radioactive. And yes, many radioactive elements, uranium, can be hit with ultraviolet light and will fluoresce. But then again, day-glow paint will do it. So will your teeth. Zinc cadmium sulfide, which is zinc, cadmium, and sulfur atoms, usually with the cadmium bound to the sulfur and then zinc bound to that, has a habit of fluorescing strongly enough and being physiologically, chemically, and radioactively stable, and being useful for detecting in really tiny amounts with ultraviolet light. 1953 and 1963, St. Louis. Local officials were told the government was testing a smokescreen to protect them from the Russians. Yes, it was a lie. Zinc cadmium sulfide fluorescent powder was released on the ground to see where it would track to by just being walked on or driven over. Released apparently by a few planes, but the people who are making that claim are all chemtrailers and they don't want to list their sources, so they're suppressing disclosure. And I can't find any confirmation it was done over St. Louis. I mean, I'm sure there is, but I can't find it. The noise you find when you look it up is nothing but people are screaming chemtrails and saying steel beams can't melt when that's not what happened too. Motorized blowers were put on top of buildings, including poor people's housing projects, some schools occupied by poor people, and from cars and trucks driven in poor neighborhoods, primarily with minorities in them. They lied to the city council and lied to them, and they did it 10 years apart, 1963 and 1953. Little too quinkly-dinkly. Fluorescent powder, St. Louis. Aerosol test, chemtrails, blah, blah, blah. No, poor people being exploited and not being told what's happening. It was used as a tracer to simulate the dispersion of anything. And those studies have been used since then. They just don't tell you what the study was they get it from. They just said a test that was done. Contamination of various environments, weapons, it doesn't matter what it's testing for. What happens when you drop talcum powder and let it move around? Now, I should also point out that one of the other things they did as a test tracer material is a scary-sounding thing that people will list on the chemtrail page as being a biologically active component, or some words like that. Lycopodium plant spores. That's the pollen from a creeping pine plant. It's all natural, organic. Monsanto. So anyway, next. Where did that, by the way, literally that would be more difficult than just making some compound that would be a fluorescent. But that was also dropped, guess what, primarily by the airplanes. Okay, let's move on. Or not. The New Jersey Zinc Company, that would be the obvious company to go to, originally manufactured zinc cadmium sulfide fluorescent powder. It's an inorganic compound. It's thought to be non-toxic to humans, animals, and plants at the time of the tests. It should also be pointed out that they would have tested this to deliberately find something dangerous about it to exploit for causing mutations in animals, killing things, whatever. The way they tested it, and they did test it, was to try to kill things with it. You don't think the military tries to kill things when they test things? I guess they do the lead testing to see if it's a supplement. Tell me you don't think the military would test literally your grandma's best cake to see if it could kill someone, I guess by choking them. It's composed of the non-radioactive isotopes of zinc, cadmium, and sulfur because the radioactive ones were more valuable and weren't asked for. It cannot be more toxic than other cadmium compounds because cadmium is the primarily one. Sulfur and zinc aren't really dangerous. Cadmium can be. It can't be worse than the ones you find naturally. Where do you find cadmium compounds? Dust, air, water, soil, and food because they're all involved in. And by the way, if you eat humans, apparently too. Cadmium is all over the place. Well, what are the levels normally found? You can test this in and out of the areas that are assumed to have been dusted. This is the range you get. 0.1 microgram per whatever. It could be gallon, I don't care. Up to 24 or higher, depending on where you are, based on whether or not the area had mining. Any area that had mining or brought in ore or brought in any kind of industrial activity will have a higher occurrence of cadmium. What areas tested, no matter how deep you dig until you get back before it was occupied by humans, what areas had the highest? St. Louis had 24 micrograms per whatever. Winnipeg has 14. Minneapolis is 7 almost. Fort Wayne, Indiana, is 1. Corpus Christi is 0.1. There's a huge amount of variation, and most of this is caused by wear and tear on the area, or whether there's a river, or whether it was a floodplain, or whether it ever had any erosion due to the Ice Age and glaciers, because it's mostly caused by digging up dirt. Cadmium binds with stuff, tends to bind deep. Plants and animals don't use it for much of anything, but it is found in them, and it tends to get percolated down, maybe in your groundwater, may not be. Well, it bioaccumulates, and it has to be radioactive because I'm punching my memes on the internet. Okay, if it bioaccumulates, that means you can test for it. When people went to court over it, they said they were exposed to this. So when they were asked, can we get a test of your bone marrow and other things because you're already going in for cancer? I won't provide it, by the way, it doesn't bioaccumulate. But you claimed on page 4 that it does bioaccumulate. That's why you're saying it's dangerous, because bioaccumulate, it's a scary word. You can't have it both ways. Then they would drop the case and file it again, hoping nobody would pay attention to the fact that they tried to pull fast one. If you're dying from cancer and you can't afford to pay for it, you might sue whoever you can just to pay for it. I wouldn't put it past anybody. I wouldn't put it past me. Okay? But the naturally occurring versions of this stuff are there. And again, zinc and sulfur aren't considered normally chemtrail compounds. But then again, wait 5 minutes. It's not a biological or radioactive weapon. Why do some people keep repeating zinc, cadmium, sulfur are somehow a radioactive element? Well, they were doing radioactive testing. Yes, keep repeating the vague statement instead of what elements were involved, what chemical. When someone is making these assertions and won't tell you exactly what they're talking about, they're not hiding something, they're just fucking lying. Later, the New Jersey U.S. corporation that made this industrial compound was switched over from the zinc company, and it went over to the Radium Corporation. The U.S. Radium Corporation also made medical, industrial, and physical research radioisotopes. Like watch dials were also made. And they did a bunch of stuff that was damaging, and they had locations that you can go track down, and they are they're horrible sites, radium and shit. But they made this stuff again. Well, maybe there was contamination. Now we're trying to shoehorn contamination. They did this stuff at a location that was tested for because the U.S. government requested not to have radium in it because radium made it more expensive. Yes, bureaucrats and pitching the lowest bidder. And then you have to even make it cheaper than that because you can't make a profit if you really do what you say you're going to do it for. Did the military sponsor 1953 and 1963 radioactive simulant studies and field trials that exposed American civilians without consent to possibly hazardous substances by only using it on vulnerable people, for instance, in St. Louis. Yes. Potentially or possibly hazardous. Did anybody show that it had any negative effects? No. Did they show that it was unusual compared to the normal industrial pollutants that were found in the city? By the way, New York City has an even higher level. It's like 50 micrograms per something at the time. And that was in Central Park. Was this from 1945 to 1970, as someone specific claims? No. These were two occurrences. One whole group of them in 1953, specifically in 1954 and 1958. And 1963. They're specific occurrences. Because money. Did they do experiments by tracking where dust went from fires? Forest fires. Yeah, they used that to track where particulate material would go. Like fallout. They use those for fallout studies. The reason we know about any of this is because of that. But I need it to be radioactive so my meme is true. No. I need it to be true so I can win a court case. No, because again, you can't claim it's bioaccumulative, but you can't detect it. If it bioaccumulates, well, it had a short half-life. That means it's no longer in their system. What's the shortest half-life? Which one was it? And yeah, they claim, well, you can find it in the dirt. That means it had a longer half-life, and it accumulated in the soil. We can't detect it all of a sudden. Yes, some people were harmed, I'm sure, but they can't find anybody who can even show proof of it. Not even in a court case. I mean, nobody even tests for it and finds it at all. They couldn't even prove they were exposed. But yeah, blowing it off the top of a poor kid's school. Next, Manhattan Project was involved in the discussion of it, and a radium corporation. So Manhattan Project, U.S. Radium Corporation, and operations of spraying stuff without people's consent. Yeah, but was it radioactive? No. Not because they were trying not to hurt people, but because they were being cheap. Really cheap. The Radium Corporation opened up a separate location simply because it was financially advantageous, because they could get a lower rate for the property, and they're already making radium dial stuff and who knows what else at another location. Also, it made it more pure dangerous in one building, and they didn't want to contaminate it with the cadmium, zinc, or sulfur. They were trying to make it more expensive stuff purer. They didn't care about this stuff. Did they contaminate, cross-contaminate? No, they didn't. The thing is that the government went through and checked it because they could. So it wasn't from 1945 to 1970. It was 2 separate years, 10 years apart for St. Louis. And the Manhattan Engineering District, that was a code name used by the Army involved in the Manhattan Project. It was not called the Manhattan Engineer District 44 or the Manhattan-Rochester Coalition. District 44, Engineering District 44 in Manhattan did exist, and there was a Manhattan-Rochester Coalition, but it was a coalition of organizations between the two cities. It had nothing to do with this, and it was much, much, much later. Someone found these words and keywords when they looked up science papers and civil documents and threw the words together in a word salad in 2011. This all may have been just made up. A sociologist getting a philosophy degree did a dissertation, made assertions, made up a story, claiming evidence that indicated a Manhattan-Rochester coalition did all of the above. Or if they did it, what would happen? This was a what-if scenario involving radioactive material because, it seems coincidental. It was literally a philosophy dissertation based on a conspiracy theory theme. May have been involved as radioactive material. The person doing it dramatized a hypothetical made-up secret post-Manhattan Project-based project on the above subject matter and mixing and matching. Now our specialties are radiological, chemical, and biological weapons testing on U.S. populations as study material. Social and community effects of hazardous waste. Government crime, etc. Lisa Martino Taylor was doing a philosophy degree and did this paper stating up front this is a hypothetical situation and threw together things that didn't exist or did exist and misrepresented them as a hypothetical scenario. What if the Manhattan Project never ended? No, duh, that's called the entire Cold War. What if they did these tests but used radioactive material? But they didn't. Well, they were doing radiation tests and radioactive fallout tests. Yes, but they weren't using radioactive material. And this may have been academic fraud. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.